Hello. Oh, wow, that's loud. Hello? Can you hear me, audience members? Having some issues with my mic. Hello. Okay, that should be better. Or just a tad. Hello. Perfect. So, one person on stream. So today we will be learning how to create what is displayed on this webpage right now, which is not just two beautiful pictures of a beautiful man, but also a way to upload images. Like this beautiful image right here. So let's go ahead and do it. We're going to create a web page where you can choose a file to upload. Click the add button and then the file will appear. So it's kind of an Imgur-esque like thing. For those of you who don't know, Imgur is a website where you can see images. So the fundamental question here is, how do you get images from a user's local computer onto a server, which makes the image accessible to the public? And we will be using Firebase to accomplish this task. There are many ways to do it. Firebase is just one of many. Another one is Cloudinator. Cloudinary. Cloudinary is another alternative to Firebase that's focused on images and video specifically. Firebase, you can upload any kind of files you want. What I like about Firebase is that it also does authentication, so you get both services on the same platform. So let's get right into it. First thing you need to do is open up Firebase. And then we have to create a project. Pick a nice name. Any name works. We don't need Google Analytics. And the project is ready. Let's do it. We'll be using 3 Firebase services today. First one is authentication. Authentication is not strictly necessary for this kind of project, but it stops random people from putting pictures in your Firebase project. So they're a little less random because they actually have to log in to your website. Setting up authentication, we're just going to use Google. Just put whatever settings you want here, it doesn't really matter. And then you click save. And then boom, we have Google authentication set up. The next service we'll be needing is storage. Storage is the Firebase service, which lets you upload any file you want onto the cloud. Just click get started, and then default settings work just great. Whatever the default settings are. Third service we're going to set up is the real-time database, which is Firebase's database service, and you can set that up by clicking on the database icon on the left-hand side. We will be using the real-time database. We will not be using the Cloud Firestore. Reason is because the real-time database is a lot easier to use. So easier is better, especially for these kinds of projects. Let's go ahead and create a database. You want to start it in test mode. Test mode means anyone on the internet can read and write. Is this dangerous? You'll probably delete this project in a couple of days, so no. But if you do decide to continue with this project, I highly recommend that you change the database rules, a topic which will not be covered in this live stream. So we click enable, and we have a database. So that's all we need to do as far as setting up Firebase is concerned. So Firebase is going to be where we upload files and where we authenticate. Firebase is like a one-stop solution, one-stop shop. You don't need a backend if you do simple projects with Firebase. So you don't need Express or Django or Ruby on Rails or any other of those backend library/frameworks. Firebase will do everything for you. All you need to do is build a front end. You might be wondering, this is amazing, why doesn't everyone do this? Reason is, Firebase is not really adapted for bigger projects. So I do use Firebase strategically in my project to accomplish very specific tasks. But I would not use Firebase to manage all my data. But for small projects where you just want to have fun and experiment, or you want to create an MVP, or anything of the sort, Firebase is amazing. So now what we're going to do is create a project. Let me just close my previous project first. We'll create a React app using this command line. And create React app is being very slow, especially since I'm streaming, which makes it even slower. We're going to be staring at this for about a minute. "67 seconds. I'll be installing the Imgur library right away because I'll be using it later. I use Imgur everywhere. Highly recommended library. Makes your life so much easier. If you have any questions, by the way, I invite you to use the chat at any time. Highly encouraged. Here's our project with the default app that everyone sees when they start a React project. Let's go ahead and install the Firebase NPM. There's actually two ways to use Firebase in your project. You can either add the Firebase NPM, or alternatively, you can put it in the index.html file. At this point, there's really no advantages to doing one way or the other. However, for a more serious project, the NPM is recommended because if you put it directly in your index.html, it might not be available at certain times if the server that you're getting it from goes down. So people generally prefer to install the NPM. It's also simpler because installing NPMs is something we do every day. We're creating a file called myfirebase. And this file will contain all the configuration code for your Firebase project. And the way we get that configuration code is in your project. You can go to project overview, and then you can click on web. You have to give your app a name. That's because there can be several apps for the same project. Any name will do. And the reason we do this is so that we can get this piece of code right here. We don't need the rest of the stuff. You can pretty much ignore everything up here and then everything here. All we care about is this piece of code. So go ahead and paste it. We're going to import this is how we import Firebase. This will give you access to all the Firebase services, including authentication, database, and storage. We export Firebase to make the file accessible to other applications, to other modules within the application. Since it is the only thing that is being exported from this file, it's recommended to use export default. Since we used export default in the my-firebase.js file, we can then import the file by simply using the syntax I've written right here. And I chose the name Firebase. The reason for that is when you copy-paste code from the Firebase documentation, that's the name they use. Makes life easier if you use the same name as the documentation. So the first thing I'm going to do is authentication. Authentication in Firebase is very simple. You use the auth module of Firebase, and then you have to choose the authentication provider. Since in my Firebase configuration I only enabled Google, there's the only one I can use in this particular project. And then you have to call sign in with pop-up. Usually you have some kind of login button that triggers these statements, interprets these statements. We're just going to put it at the top level because this is a really tiny project and we don't really care at this point. We're going to build our amazing UI. And And now we will visualize the UI that we made. So this is the user interface. It's not particularly useful. Doesn't do anything at this point. What we need to do is have the user select the file that he wants, and then we will upload that file to Firebase. So let's do the first part, which is letting the user select the file. And storing their selection in computer memory. To do this, I will use state. There's actually a better way to do it than state. I'll explain that in a bit. However, state works, so we might as well use it for this kind of small project. So we will be updating the state with the file that the user has chosen. And this function will be run every time the user selects a file and clicks submit. The key point here is that you have to do .target.files, and then that returns something which is similar to an array, and then we can just get the first element taking the first index. Let's see if that works. We can see whether or not it works by using the React DevTools. So we see here that the state is empty. And now the state has a property file. It doesn't actually show you the file, but this is not an empty object. Just React Developer Tools represents it as an empty object because it doesn't actually know how to display it properly. We have a question from Ksenia. What does Imgur do? Good question, Ksenia. Imgur's website where you can upload images so that other people can view those images. It's basically an image sharing website. So that's what we're creating today. I hope that answers your question. So we saw that choosing a file modifies the state, which is exactly what we want. Next thing we need to do is take that file that the user selected and upload it to Firebase. So the submit button needs an on-click. I'm not using a form here. If you were using a form, you'd have to modify the on-submit of the form element. Since we don't have a form element, we're just going to put an on-click on the button. And then we will generate a random ID, because otherwise different users might overwrite their images if we give it the same name. We generate a new name for this image, and that name will be associated with the image inside Firebase storage, right here. Then we create the reference that's going to store the image. And then we're going to, this last line right here puts the image in the cloud. We do not need the await yet. So whether you put await here, it does not actually make a difference. However, we will be adding code. And the await is there because we want to wait that we have finished uploading before we continue. We will see that later. So let's see if that works. It needs to be an async function. Good. So we're going to choose a file, and then we will click submit, and we get an error. Expected blob or file. There should be a state.file because that's what we added to the state. So I submitted the file, and if I go to my Firebase console and I go to storage, I see that I have my file right here. I can actually click on the file to see a preview. So my file went from my computer onto the cloud. So that's step number 1. Step number 2 is getting users to be able to retrieve this file from the Firebase server. The user needs to know that this file exists. So when we upload the file to storage, we also need to create a new record in our database that will refer to this file. So this line will create a new node in our database under the posts path. And it will contain an object with one property UID. And UID will refer to the location of the file. Let's go ahead and test that out. So I submitted the file. Our hope is that we created a document inside our real-time database. And we have. If you look at the file, if you look at the document, it has a UID of 465, some atrociously long number that ends in 65. And if you look at your storage, you'll see that you have the particular reference right there. So now we're able to upload a file to Firebase storage. We're able to create a document inside the database that refers to that file. The next step is to actually retrieve that information. And unfortunately, the path that is stored, this UID, is not a URL, meaning that it is not meaningful to a web browser. So we need to convert this UID to a URL. You have a component right here that does exactly that. The main meat of this component is right here. So this will take a UID. It's called a UID. This will take a UID and get the URL associated with that UID. And that is actually promise. So we need to use await. And we can't use async await directly in an effect. We need to wrap it inside an async function and then run the function after. Finally, once we have the URL, we store it in the state. Then we'll re-render the component. And once the component is re-rendered, we can extract the URL and display it. Initially, at the first render, we do not have the URL. We have to retrieve the URL from Firebase, and that takes time. So at the first render, we are going to display nothing. At the second render, we will be retrieving. We will have the URL in the state, and then we just have to display it. So the second render, this will be displayed. Any questions from the audience? No questions. Let's continue on. We would like to see all the images as they're being uploaded in real time. So what we're going to do is use onChildAdded. So every time any document gets created in the /posts path in the database, which just so happens to be right here, this callback will get called. And when this callback is called, it modifies the image paths, which needs to be in the state. And it pushes the UID into the state. So image paths is going to be an array of UIDs. Xenia has a question. All good. Oh, perfect, Xenia. Finally, we need to display those images. So we take the image paths and we map over it. And then we're able to view them one by one. Let's go ahead and look at that. Use effect is not defined. So go ahead and choose another file. And there you have it. Real-time image sharing between people. So to recap, we have a way for people to upload images, which is the input, followed by a button which triggers a function call that runs this part right here, which is what puts the image inside the Firebase storage. And then this part right here that creates a document in the real-time database that will refer to this image. Every time a document gets added to the real-time database, this callback is going to get called, which modifies the state and adds the UID to the state. Every time this happens, because there's a set state, there's a re-render, and this image path gets was updated, and we can do a dot map, passing the UID to Firebase IMG. And then finally, Firebase IMG is going to display the image. It's first going to convert the UID to a URL using get download URL. Once it's converted, it's going to modify the state to store the URL so that it's re-rendered and we get to see the image. So that's the application as a whole. One thing to note, we're using a set state when the file gets modified here, which causes a re-render. This is, well, I mean, slightly inefficient, but we don't really care about that. An alternative would be to use useref. We called it file. So with useRef, it's similar to useState in that it is persistent. It is different from useState in that if you modify the current value of the file, it will not actually re-render the component. And in this case, it makes sense because re-rendering the component when the user selects a file isn't really useful because we have nothing to display to the user. Ala writes, "Go Jack, go." Oh, I have 6 people on stream now.